Hello and welcome to this presentation on exchange in the lungs, and you'll notice in brackets there I've put "and intestines" as well. There'll be just a short reference to the intestines towards the end to illustrate a point which will become clear, but most of this is about the lungs and how they work and how they're involved in breathing. So let's start by having a look at the lungs and their main structure. A nice simple diagram here with just the key points labelled for you. So here's how it works. Air is breathed in down this pipe here called the trachea, the windpipe, and that splits into two bronchi, each one known as a bronchus, but the two together are bronchi. And they get narrower and narrower and narrower until you have these really fine tubes here called bronchioles. You can see it labelled there. Sorry my voice is so husky, by the way, I've got a cold from somewhere. At the end of the bronchioles are these clusters of air sacs. They look like tiny bunches of grapes and they're called air sacs. And that's the part really that we're most interested in a way, because this is where the gaseous exchange takes place. It's where the oxygen that's breathed in goes into the blood to zoom off around the body, and it's where the carbon dioxide that's been around the body goes back into the lungs to be breathed out. And we'll look more at what happens in the air sacs a little bit later on. We've also got the ribs here, and the ribs are there for two reasons. First of all, they give some protection to the lungs and to the heart. That's the heart there. So they provide some protection for it. But also, they're needed in order to breathe. The muscles, the intercostal muscles, pull the rib cage upwards and outwards when we breathe. And so, without the ribs, breathing would not be possible. And then this little fella down here, this flat layer of muscle, is called the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is also involved in breathing. It's a huge stretched muscle across the bottom of the thorax. All of this together is known as the thorax. This part of the body, you've got your abdomen down here and your thorax there. So yeah, we've got the trachea and bronchi through which we breathe in and out. And because they're under a lot of pressure, as the air is forced in and out of them, they have these rings of cartilage around them. They give some support and stop those from rupturing under the pressure of the air surging in and out. I'm going to show you another diagram of this now. It'll look a little bit more cluttered, but I think you'll see the key structures rather more clearly. So here it is, another diagram showing the same thing as the previous one. Let's just trace over the various bits for you again to make sure you've got it. This is more like the diagram you'll get in the exam, although not in lovely purple and yellow colour, of course. So you've got the trachea, the trachea here, with its rings of cartilage around it, the bronchi, leading down to the bronchioles, and then the air sacs here, where gaseous exchange takes place. You've got the ribs, which are the yellow structures. Now look, and you've got the muscles, the intercostal muscles that link the ribs together, clearly there. And at the bottom, the sheet of muscle that is the diaphragm. You can see where the heart is there as well. Okay, now what I want to do now is to just show you a little bit more clearly what an air sac looks like. I think in the exam, if they're going to ask you a question about this, and there's a really good chance there'll be a question on the lungs, the part they're most likely to focus on is the air sac. So let's take a look at what happens inside there. So here is one air sac. Let me enlarge it for you. I'm sorry about the spelling mistake with blood there in the top right. I should have changed that really. But anyway, here's an air sac. This is the end of the bronchiole. The air moves in and out of the air sac as we breathe. And the function of that, of course, is the stale air with carbon dioxide gets expelled from the body, and fresh air with oxygen in gets drawn in from the body. And the fine tubes are called blood capillaries. They're the narrowest blood vessels in the body. They're really narrow, and I'll show you more on that in a moment. The blue blood here is returning from a journey round the body. It's been round, it's dropped off all of its oxygen, and it's returning to the lungs with very little oxygen in it, but lots of carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide is going to diffuse through the walls of the air sacs before being exhaled. Meanwhile, the fresh air that's coming in, bringing the oxygen will diffuse into the blood, because there's very little oxygen in it at this point here. The oxygen diffuses in before being carried off around the body. These swellings here are important structures. The air sac has lots of these swellings on that make it resemble a bunch of grapes, and they're called alveoli. In fact, that word's so important it really should be there. Give me one tick. So each one of these is an alveolus. Each one of these swellings is an alveolus. And what's happening here is called gaseous exchange, the exchange of gases. Carbon dioxide from the body being exchanged for oxygen from the air. And of course this oxygen, when it goes off around the body, it's going to be dropped off at all of the cells that need it for respiration. Now I'd just like to show you more clearly what happens in each alveolus here. So I'm going to zoom in now on one of these in a lovely diagram for you. So here is one alveolus. This is a great picture, and if you can get your head around this one, I think you'll appreciate everything there is really to know about the way the lungs work. So the blood has been round the body and is returning here in this narrow capillary. It's travelling through here like this, and you'll notice that the blood cells appear to change colour as we venture through the capillary. And the reason for that is that when they return to the lungs from the body, they've got very little oxygen in them. Lots of carbon dioxide, but very little oxygen. Now, because there's a high level of carbon dioxide in here, it's going to diffuse through the walls of the capillary and the alveolus into the air sac. There's a diffusion gradient, and a very steep diffusion gradient. A high concentration of carbon dioxide here, a low concentration here because we keep breathing it out, and so it gives you a nice steep diffusion gradient, and the CO2 will diffuse through really very quickly indeed. Now in the meantime, the fresh air coming in has got a high level of oxygen in it, but there's very little oxygen here. So again, there's a diffusion gradient, so the oxygen diffuses through the wall of the alveolus and the wall of the capillaries into the blood, and again this happens very quickly as the blood passes through the lungs. So key here is the idea of a diffusion gradient. We have to keep ventilating the air sac to get rid of the carbon dioxide and to bring the oxygen back. By getting rid of the carbon dioxide, we keep this diffusion gradient going, and by bringing fresh oxygen back, we keep this diffusion gradient going. And in that way, we make sure that there's a constant exchange of gases. This is why, if for some reason you can't breathe properly, if your chest stops moving, you haven't got very long to live, because you're not replenishing this air in the lungs, and the CO2 will build up, and there won't be enough oxygen in. The oxygen levels will become in equilibrium with the blood here, and so you would end up dying. A really important diagram, and it does show the key adaptations of the lungs for transfer of gases, and this is really important on the high paper as well. I'm going to quickly go through those now for you. It does you well, or you will do well, to remember these little adaptations I'm going to mention to you now. Let's have a look at them. Right, firstly, there's a really big surface area, and that's achieved by having those alveoli, the swellings on the surface of the lungs, on the air sacs. The alveoli give a bigger surface area. In fact, it's so big that it's akin to the size of a tennis court. Without those swellings, it would be much, much smaller. And there are some illnesses, in fact, in which the alveoli burst, and those people really struggle to breathe because of the reduced surface area of their lungs. So a big surface area is the key adaptation. Here's another one. The exchange surface must be really, really thin. And you'll notice that this layer of cells here, the so-called epithelial layer, is flattened. It's really flat so that the gases can easily pass through it. It's a single layer of cells, and they're really flattened. And the same for the cells from which the capillary is made. These are also epithelial cells, thin and flattened. And that means that the pathway that the oxygen has to go through is really very short indeed, and that means diffusion will be quicker. So a large surface area is important, and the exchange surface must be really, really thin. That's another one. Thirdly, there's a good blood supply here. If there wasn't, everything else I've described, the large surface area and the thinness, would be a bit of a waste of time. Because we do need the waste gases to be returned to the lungs, and we do need a way of swiftly removing the oxygen from the lungs to keep the diffusion gradient going. If this became sluggish, then this blood would slow down, the diffusion gradient would get into equilibrium, and the diffusion would stop. So by having a good blood supply, it just means that we keep replenishing the blood to allow diffusion to take place. And fourthly, in the lungs, that good ventilation that I've referred to is vital. Without it, the whole system would break down. So if in the exam you're asked to identify 4 features of the lungs that make them great for transfer of gases, these are the 4 that you need to know. And I would pause the presentation here and just check that you can remember them. The large surface area, the thin exchange surfaces, the great blood supply, and the fact that ventilation takes place. That's key, and I'll return to these a little bit later on. But now I want to focus on the idea of ventilation. How does this happen? I've referred to it many times, but what is it that the body does to keep the air ventilating and keep us breathing? Well, these 2 diagrams illustrate it brilliantly. On the left, this person is breathing in. On the right, this person is breathing out. And there are 5 steps that you need to be aware of that take place for inspiration or expiration, and I'll talk you through them now. Step 1 is that the intercostal muscles that link the ribs together, they contract, they get shorter. So step 1, the intercostal muscles contract. Step 2, this lifts the rib cage upwards and outwards, so the chest rises up. Now that has an effect on the volume of the thorax. Oh, sorry, one more thing first. The other thing is that the diaphragm, I nearly forgot that, that would have been terrible. The diaphragm here, look, is quite flat. So the first 3 steps, the intercostal muscles contract, the rib cage moves upwards and outwards, and thirdly, the diaphragm is fairly flat. Now these changes produce an effect which is to increase the volume of the thorax, the chest cavity. It becomes much, much bigger. So the contracting intercostal muscles, the rib cage moving upwards and outwards, and the diaphragm flattening gives a huge volume in the rib cage here. So I'm getting obsessed with colouring this in now. I want to make sure there are no gaps. That'll do. So a huge surface, a huge volume, I should say. Now this huge volume means that air will be drawn into the lungs from the outside world. All right, the air gets drawn in because of the lower pressure. So again, step 1, intercostal muscles contract. Step 2, rib cage moves upwards and outwards. Step 3, diaphragm flattens. Step 4, all of these changes increase the volume of the thorax, increasing it dramatically. So step 5, the reduced air pressure caused by that expanding volume draws air in through the nose and the mouth. That's breathing in. Now in breathing out, the reverse happens. The intercostal muscles now relax. The intercostal muscles between the ribs relax. This means that the rib cage now falls downwards and inwards. So the chest moves down when you're breathing out. The diaphragm becomes dome-shaped. There we go, just there, look. That's step 3. So step 4, all of these changes reduce the volume. That's to colour in this time. Reduce the volume of the thorax quite noticeably, actually. If you compare the blue shading on the right to the blue on the left, you can see that the volume is a lot lower. It's reduced the volume, and that creates air pressure in the lungs, or I should say the air pressure in the lungs increases, and that means that we breathe out through our mouth and nose. The air gets expelled. Now these 5 stages are really important to remember. And so again, I would just make sure that you can, in fact with the next slide I'll make so that it does test you that you know them. So you need to know all 5 of those stages as we venture through the process of breathing in and breathing out. This diagram here helps you to see it from the front of the body. So again, step 1, breathing in. This is breathing in, hang on. Breathing in, breathing out. By the way, I'm sorry, I've got a bit of a cold today, so I'm trying not to sniffle too much. I have to keep pausing to blow my nose. So here we go then. This is breathing in. The intercostal muscles contract. They pull against each other like that. Intercostal muscles contract. The rib cage lifts upwards and outwards. The diaphragm becomes flattened. The volume of the thorax therefore increases. The pressure on the inside is therefore lower, so the air races in to the lungs. And breathing out, the intercostal muscles now relax. The rib cage moves down and in. The diaphragm becomes dome-shaped. All of this now lowers the volume of the thorax. So there's pressure now inside the lungs, so the air gets expelled. Now I'm going to test you. Of course I can't hear you, so I don't know whether you're getting them right or not, but you'll know. So let's talk about breathing in. I'll give you the part of the body and you tell me what it does when we breathe in. So firstly, the intercostal muscles. When we breathe in, what happens to them? They contract. Secondly, the rib cage. What does that do? It moves upwards and outwards. The diaphragm becomes flattened. This is all breathing in, remember. So the volume of the thorax is now really very big indeed. And that lowers the air pressure in the lungs, or in the thorax, I should say. So air races into the lungs and inflates them. Now let me cover those up again. And now we'll try the reverse. What happens when we exhale, when we breathe out? What do the intercostal muscles do now to breathe out? They relax. The rib cage now falls down and inwards. The diaphragm becomes dome-shaped. All of these changes make the volume of the thorax smaller, creating air pressure inside it, and so the higher air pressure inside the thorax forces air out of the lungs through the nose and the mouth. I hope you've got that now. Now here's a very famous experiment that often gets referred to in exams, not in this form, but often they'll show you two test tubes from a modern laboratory, and I think you've done this in class as well. So let me explain what the experiment shows. What's the point of it? Well, this fella here is breathing in and out through this tube. He should really be wearing a nose clip, but he breathes in and out through the tube. And actually, I suppose he can't wear a nose clip, otherwise he wouldn't get any fresh air, would he? I don't know. Anyway, he breathes in and out through this tube, the air going to his lungs like that. And when he breathes in, the air comes in down this long glass tube here, bubbles through this substance, which is lime water. And the thing with lime water is it goes cloudy when it's got a lot of carbon dioxide in it. When he breathes in, the lime water doesn't go cloudy at all, because the level of CO2, the concentration of carbon dioxide in air, is tiny. It's less than 1%. But you can see the bubbles, proving that the air is coming in. And then goes up through his mouth, down his trachea, bronchioles, air sacs, into his lungs. Before he exhales the air comes out, and because of the valve setup, it bubbles through this tube this time, bubbling through the lime water again before leaving the equipment and going back into the atmosphere. Now what actually happens in this experiment is that one bottle of lime water goes milky. Which one do you think it is? Yes, it's this one here. It goes cloudy or milky, and that shows that there is lots more carbon dioxide being bubbled through this bottle than the one on the left, a lot more. And this experiment was the first to show that we exhale far more carbon dioxide than we breathe in. And it was from this experiment that scientists worked out that the body is actually producing carbon dioxide. Now, since this experiment was done, another one has been invented to show that the body consumes oxygen, and that happened not long afterwards. And so this was for the first time we understood that oxygen was taken in and carbon dioxide given out. We knew the nature of breathing. You don't need to know the oxygen experiment, but if you could remember this one, that would be terrific news. The lime water changes colour, becomes cloudy as the level of CO2 increases in it, and that shows that respiration is producing carbon dioxide. We're nearly there now. Just a couple of quick pictures for you, and then a little tiny bit on the intestine. This device here used to be called an iron lung. There's not very much iron about this one because it's a modern version. But the way that it works is this: if somebody for some reason is unable to breathe, maybe they damage their chest or the intercostal muscles stop working, or the brain isn't sending signals to get this working properly, then this device is used to ventilate the lungs. And the way that it works is pretty clever. Air is drawn out of the chamber using this pump. It's pulled out, creating a negative pressure, a lower pressure, a negative pressure inside the chamber. Now, in the same way as when the diaphragm falls, what happens is air tries to rush into the chamber because of the lower air pressure. This collar here fits around the neck really tightly so that air can't seep in through the collar. So the only way for air to get into this chamber, or into the volume in here, is by going through the patient's nose and mouth and into their lungs. And that's exactly what happens. It's a way of drawing air into the lungs by reducing the pressure in the chamber. You're taking air out of the chamber, making it negative, and therefore air races in to fill the lungs. Then every so often, the pump is switched off, and the natural elasticity of the lungs forces the air out again. And it's switched on, and more moves in, and so on and so forth. So this is a negative pressure chamber. The air is taken out to help ventilate the lungs. Compare that with this, which is a positive breathing system. In this one, air isn't taken out of the system, air is pumped from the pump here, through the tube, into the lungs directly. Again, it's important that the mask, or the seal on the mask, is airtight. It's fitted very tightly to the patient, and the air is forced into their lungs. The chest will now rise up, and then every now and again the pump cuts out, and the natural elasticity of the lungs and the rib cage means that it falls back and expels the air through the machine. So this is different to the previous one because it has positive pressure. It's forcing air into the lungs instead of pulling air out of the area around the lungs, around the body, I should say. And that's the key difference, isn't it? Whereas this is injecting into the lungs, the other one was lowering pressure around the body. Try to remember these two. They'll be very useful for you in the exam. And very finally then, a look at exchange in the gut. Now you might think, why has he gone on to talk about the intestines? The whole of this presentation is concentrated on the lungs, and now we're bringing the intestines into it to confuse us. Well, the reason is that this is an exchange surface, and they might relate the adaptations of the exchange surface to the intestines. So very briefly, the food's travelled... Oops, hang on. Sorry about that. The food has travelled down here into the intestines. This is where the food is. The blood that we need to carry the food away, the glucose, the amino acids, fatty acids, glycerol, that sort of thing, the blood to carry it away is in this area around here. And the food, the digested food particles, have to get through into the blood. Now the intestines are about 7 metres long, which is great, it's a good length, but even that wouldn't give enough surface area to absorb all of the food that you need. So these little tiny finger-like structures called villi are there. Here they are, look, poking up, and they dramatically increase the surface area of the intestine spectacularly. And so the digested food can diffuse through into the blood. Here's the blood here, look. And that's going to take away the food to the liver and around the body to fuel respiration or whatever. Okay, let's have a look at a villus, one of these little finger-like things, in detail. Here, in fact, are a couple of them. And what happens here is that the food that we've eaten is here. It diffuses through the villi into the blood to be carried off around the body. Now I want to just quickly go through the adaptations of this, and these will be fairly familiar with you, fairly familiar to you. Most of them will anyway. Let's have a look. Firstly then, a large surface area. Our old mate, large surface area. The villi do the same job as the alveoli in the lungs. They increase the surface area. Secondly, just like in the lungs, the surface is thin. We have epithelial cells, a single layer of cells around the villus, and the same in the blood capillaries here. Their structure is exactly the same as the blood capillaries in the lungs. They're leaky and they let the food in. The third one is just the same as well. It's that good blood supply, the same thing that we had in the lungs. But the fourth one is slightly different. We can't say ventilation takes place because that implies that air is moved in and out. And we don't want air moving in and out of the intestines, otherwise we'd have chronic wind all the time. So we don't quite phrase it in the same way. Instead we talk about the movement of a medium, and actually in the exam I'd maybe leave this one out, I'd stick with the first three, but it does mean that there is a constant source of new molecules, new food passing over the villi in the same way there's a constant source of oxygen moving over the surface of the lungs. But that, if you get that, great. If you don't worry too much about it. These three will see you through. Just like the lungs, there's a large surface area, there's a thin surface, and there's a good old blood supply. And that completes this presentation. Thank you for bearing with me in it. There are the key things that we've spoken about, just to jog your memory. The structure of the thorax with its rib cage and so on. The way that gas is exchanged in the air sacs, in the alveoli. Those adaptations of large surface area, thin surface and good blood supply. The way that ventilation works, with the intercostal muscles, the rib cage moving up, the diaphragm flattening and so on. A bit about artificial breathing and negative pressure drawing air into the lungs, positive pressure forcing air into the lungs, and exchange in the gut by way of a comparison. That's it. Thank you very much indeed. It's not been the easiest of presentations to make or for you to listen to, I guess, really. So thank you for getting through it, and I'll see you next time.